Claire Bellerjeau currently serves as historian and director of education at Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, New York, and has been researching the Townsend family and their slaves for over 16 years, including curating a year-long exhibit on the Townsend Slave Bible in 2005. In 2015, during a research visit to the New York Historical Society, she discovered what may be one of the earliest poems ever written by Jupiter Hammond, America's first published African-American writer. She has spoken internationally and published several articles in scholarly journals about life and artifacts of colonial New York. Ms. Bellerjeau lives with her husband, Chris, in New York City. Tiffany Brooks holds a PhD in American and Dramatic Literature from Florida State University and has spoken and published widely on early portrayals of race in transatlantic performance, as well as the emerging American identity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She was the lead researcher and contributing writer for the New York Times bestselling George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, and Andrew Jackson and the Miracle at New Orleans, as well as for Fear is a Choice with Pittsburgh Steelers running back James Conner and Limitless with Paralympic gold medalist Mallory Wegman. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Claire Bellerjeau. Take it away, Claire.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today, and I just want to welcome everybody. It's a wonderful thing that we can all get together and explore this new history. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can give you even more visuals to look at and really help you understand this story. And let's see here, make it start playing. Yes. So the reason why we're here to talk to you today is about our book, Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, and how it tells the story of a new historic founding figure, a woman named Elizabeth, or Liz. And so to really learn about Liz, we have to enter her world. We have to understand the world that she lived in. Liz was born into slavery around 1763 at the home of the Townsend family in Oyster Bay, New York. And it's amazing to discover a founding figure who already has a museum that is her birthplace. So this is Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay. And now it is interpreted as both the home of the Townsend family and also the birthplace of Liz. Jeff, I'm noticing that my screen is a little jumpy. Are you hearing me and seeing me okay?
We are hearing you okay. The slide transition just seems to be a little bit slow, but everything's coming through.
Okay, great. Don't be afraid to jump in if anything goes sideways.
Sure.
We're all used to that with Zoom, right?
Yes.
So she was born into this household. Now, at that time, every one of the 13 colonies had legal slavery. And the colony that she was born into, New York, had actually the most slavery of any of the northern colonies. So in 1770, when she was a child, if you had added up all the slaves in the New England colonies and added them together, New York had more. Look at Pennsylvania, geographically kind of a similar size to New York, but New York had almost 4 times as many slaves. And now even look down at the colony of Georgia. In 1770, New York had more slavery than Georgia. Now, many decades before Liz was born, there was a New York law that said that every town in New York must have an official town-appointed slave whipper. So every town had a whipping post. Every town had paid slave whippers. They would be paid in today's money, the equivalent of about $25 per whipping. I was able to locate these names very easily. I simply looked in the town record books of Oyster Bay. So I invite you to find your town record books and see if these names might appear in your town. If you look at the bottom date, 1714, Oyster Bay had an appointed slave whipper before the law came into effect. And it wasn't just in those early days. Slavery was quite harsh all the way through, up into the 1800s. This is an 1802 Oyster Bay record of a blacksmith being paid to collar and shackle a slave, putting a band and bolt on a black, 3 wearing irons and 1 ring. Later on in that same blacksmith's book that's in our collection at Raynham Hall, this blacksmith is actually being paid to do a torture to a Black person called breaking on the wheel in medieval times. He's being paid for strapping a Black for a welt, for a beating, to a wagon tire with an extra charge for 12 nails and putting it on. That's an 1808 record of an incident that happened, a torture that happened in the middle of the town square in Oyster Bay. The newspapers of this era are full of runaway slave ads. And these runaway slave ads can really inform us about the culture of slavery on Long Island. I chose this one because this one actually is from Oyster Bay, and it's a Townsend family member, a Mr. John Townsend. He's offering $5 reward for a man who was 5 feet 10 inches high, well-made, middle-aged, and had resided in Oyster Bay for about a year. It says he's passing himself as free by the name of Isaac Johnston. But they don't give him the right to that last name. They simply call him Isaac. And Robert Townsend was born into this same world. He was born in 1753 into a quite wealthy family, a family of shipping merchants. And they had many sons, Solomon, Samuel Jr., Robert, William, and David, and 3 daughters, Audrey, Sally, and Phoebe. This isn't a painting of that family, but it's a period painting of that time, of the sort of family that they were. Robert, although he wasn't very well known in his life as the standout child, he is the one that's most known today. Because in the 1920s, through handwriting analysis, it was discovered that he was a spy for General George Washington, who went under the spy name Culper Jr. And the stories of the spies were what we talked about at the museum, the stories of a Revolutionary War patriot father, the story of how the British used the house as their headquarters and lived in the house. And we would have always just been telling those stories of the American Revolution. But 16 years ago, everything changed because the phone rang. It was a New York City auction house, Swan Galleries, and they were alerting us to the fact that a Townsend descendant had put a Bible up for sale, a Bible they thought we would surely want to bid on. Well, we already owned a few Bibles, so we were skeptical at first, but they were right. We did want to win that bid. It cost us $10,000, but this was no ordinary Bible. It had the names of the enslaved people of that household written in it. And up until that point, we were completely ignorant of the fact that any slaves had lived there, completely ignorant of the fact that slavery was even happening in Long Island. But here were the names: Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susan, Susanna, Harry, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, another Susanna, Marianne, Jane, and Gabriel. And not just names, sometimes the exact day they were born, sometimes just the month and the year, sometimes when they died. And in one case, how they died, and also how they were related to each other. A second page gave even more information, more names: Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh. And it also confirmed that these were the slaves of the family of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay. It took me a long time to really understand that Bible, what that record really meant. And I mounted a whole exhibit about it and did even more research. And that research uncovered other people who were enslaved there whose names weren't in the Bible, like John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, Amos Burling, and then 2 people who had records that were distinct, but the records didn't include their names. So I call them the unnamed child and the unnamed man. But the person who I discovered with the greatest story of all of them was Elizabeth, whose nickname was Liz. And you're going to see this image of Elizabeth a lot during my talk. And I just want to be upfront. This is not an old painting. We don't even know if Elizabeth looked like this. This is a painting that I commissioned by talking with an artist and telling her what I knew about Elizabeth and asking her to paint me an artist interpretation. I wanted a visual, and this was the visual that I got. So ironically, after all that research, I realized that there were more slaves in the household than members of the Townsend family, at least 20 that I found records of. So with 10 family members in the Townsends, the slaves outnumbered them 2-to-1. And so in the museum where we interpret rooms, we established a room as slaves' quarters, not because we knew through factual evidence that this was the room where they lived, but because it was an uncomfortable room near the other bedrooms with a bad roof line. And just out of sight of this photo, there's a narrow, very steep, small staircase that goes down to the area of the house where the kitchen was. And enslaved people were doing a lot of that kitchen up to a full attic, which is not a space where the public is allowed to go. And we acknowledge that enslaved people probably lived in that attic. They also probably lived in the basement. This family had 350 acres of land with barns and outbuildings, and no doubt enslaved people who worked in those fields lived in those outbuildings as well. And so we invite the public now at Raynham Hall to really consider slavery, not as something that happened in the South, not as something that happened in the Civil War, but something that happened in our country's founding. And we want you to make room in that story of America's birth for these people. Make room to tell their story too. Now, Samuel Townsend, the father of this household, had been a real town leader. He had been the town clerk, the town justice of the peace. And in 1775, as the Revolutionary War really kicked off, he stuck his neck out and became a leader in the New York Provincial Congress. Why is he sticking his neck out? Because most Long Islanders were not on the Patriot side. Most of them were loyalists. So he was going against most of his neighbors. And as part of being in that New York Congress, he was sworn to a solemn oath of secrecy. They didn't want anything that they were doing in their planning meetings to be spoken of outside of those meetings. And then in 1776, we declared our independence, right? No more secrets for us. We want to be America, and we're saying it out loud. But just 1 month after we declared our independence, Samuel found himself in Jamaica delivering letters between our biggest Long Island general, General Nathaniel Woodhull, and letters into George Washington. General Nathaniel Woodhull had a problem. There was a battle brewing in Brooklyn, and he badly needed reinforcements. He needed at least 2 regiments, 500 men, or he couldn't enter that battle. Unfortunately, Washington could not send him those men, and Washington sent another message that Samuel had to deliver. That message was that Long Island was being abandoned. We lost the Battle of Long Island. We lost it badly. We were greatly outnumbered, 20,000 British and Hessians against 8,000 or so Americans. And worse than being outnumbered, we were outmaneuvered. The British had done a long night march and flanked us around Jamaica Pass and surrounded us on 3 sides. All that General Washington could do was retreat. Luckily, a heavy fog fell, and he was able to ferry his entire army over to Manhattan Island. But General Woodhull ended up being surrounded at a tavern in Jamaica and struck with swords and grievously injured. Weeks later, he would die from those injuries. So all of Long Island, after just 1 month after the declaration, became British territory. And very soon after that, all of New York City became British headquarters. And everybody living here, including the Townsends and all of their enslaved people, were living behind enemy lines. That lasted for the entire war, 7 long years. And so in the fall of 1778, one of the many regiments that came and took over our town was led by a man named Colonel John Graves Simcoe. He was commander of a regiment called the Queen's Rangers. They were a regiment of about 350 British soldiers. They were all provincials. They were all people who were born in America. And he made the Townsend house his home, and he also made the house his regimental headquarters. And this was typical. Every regiment that would come into Oyster Bay, their commander would live in our house, and they would use the house as headquarters. So this room down here is our parlor. Before and after the war, it's a place where visitors would have come. But during the war, you could imagine British officers sitting in all these chairs, because this was where they would have their daily officers' meetings. Now, Simcoe was quite an interesting guy. If any of you have been watching that show on TV called Turn, they show him as a real villain. But the family didn't feel that way. They said of all the commanders that stayed in the house, Simcoe was the most honorable. One of the honorable things about him was that he believed slavery was morally wrong. In fact, before he commanded the Queen's Rangers, he wanted to raise a regiment of escaped American slaves and lead them into battle. But the British Army didn't let him do that. And after the war, he went up to Canada, founded the city of Toronto, and passed the first slavery laws in Canada in the 1790s, way ahead of New York, way ahead of England, and way, way, way ahead of America. Now, he had a good friend. His friend was Major John Andre. And in March of 1779, Andre wanted to come to the Townsend's house for a visit. He simply needed a vacation from work. He was more than just a friend. Andre was the top British spy master. Andre was in charge of all the spying on the British side. And so Andre is living in the house where George Washington's top New York City spy grew up and often visited. Of course, Andre didn't know that Robert Townsend was a spy for Washington, and the Townsend family had no idea that Andre was a spy. This is the room where Simcoe billeted and where Andre came to stay, where all the other British commanders would live as well. Now, Liz, as part of her duties as a household slave, would have had a lot of contact with these men. Simcoe was there that first visit for 6 long months. Now, the teenage girls in the Townsend family wouldn't have been allowed to go inside that room, but Liz would have gone in there every day to tighten the bedrobes, to warm the bed, to empty the chamber pot, to bring food, to clean. And later on, Robert described Liz this way. He said she was too fond of the British officers. So perhaps she was charismatic, very social. Perhaps she was beautiful and intelligent. Meanwhile, at the same time, Robert Townsend is living in New York City. A man named Abraham Woodhull, a cousin of that fallen general, is way out in Setauket in Suffolk County, and they have begun to spy for General George Washington. In the beginning, I believe Robert, who was living at Abraham Woodhull's sister's house in New York City, was a man that Woodhull referred to as a faithful friend, someone who provided him with the best intelligence. Now, later on, Robert would take on the role as lead spy in New York City, but I think in the beginning, he was just an informant. He had a shop, a general merchandise store that was part of his father's shipping business down in a place called Hanover Square. And here's an ad from that store. He was in a perfect position to be a spy because people were coming in and out of his store, and he knew all the ship's captains down at the dock. Now, at the end of this long stay, in May of 1779, Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers left Oyster Bay. And as they left, Liz escaped with them. Simcoe, who thought slavery was morally wrong, who knew that the British were about to offer American slaves their freedom if they would escape with the British and join the British effort, allowed and helped her to escape. 8 days later, Robert wrote to his own father about that escape. We know that his father had written an initial letter to him. That letter is lost to history, but we do have Robert's response, and it's pretty interesting. At the bottom of this first page, Robert writes, "The Queen's Rangers are now beyond King's Bridge." So Robert perhaps had been following them on horseback. King's Bridge is the upper tip of Manhattan, where a physical bridge was. It was a toll bridge to get off of Manhattan Island. He goes on to say, if I see any of the officers, will make inquiry for Liz. So he's going to ask about her. Though I think there is no probability of your getting her again, believe you should reckon her amongst your other dead losses. You should write off the value of your lost slave. Now, Liz has just escaped. Why isn't Robert saying to his father, Father, I have put the runaway slave ad in the paper, and I've described what you told me Liz was wearing when she escaped. I've got your reward money in hand, and if anyone captures Liz, I'll be sure to pay them that money. Runaway slave ads were what you did when your slave escaped. You didn't just say, I know where they are, and you're never going to get her back again. Then Robert pins the blame directly on Simcoe, saying, I'm surprised that Colonel Simcoe would permit her to go. He certainly must have known it when they left Oyster Bay. Now, we also know that Liz didn't stay with the Queen's Rangers. The Queen's Rangers came back to Oyster Bay 3 months later, and Liz was not with them. Soon after she escaped, she was re-enslaved by a British officer in New York City. And it was right about that time when Robert took on his role as the lead spy in New York City, taking on the spy name Culper Jr. Here on this graphic, you can see a list of important words that had all been assigned numbers. This was done by the American spy master, Benjamin Talmadge. He supplied this list to the spies so that they could write numbers in their secret spy letters instead of words to keep secret the information from the British. Robert also wrote about receiving this, which was called a dictionary. That was his copy of the list. He went on to say, I will be glad to have the stain as soon as possible. Who wants a stain, right? Well, this stain was very different. This stain was invisible ink. The stain was a liquid that you could write on clean white paper, writing between the lines of another letter. It would completely disappear. When your recipient got that letter, they had to have a second liquid called the counterpart, which they could brush on and the words would reappear. So Robert is now lead spy in New York City, and Liz has arrived and is living in the city with a British officer. Now, just after that happened, Abraham Woodhull wrote in one of his spy letters, think by the assistance of a 355. If you look on that list of numbers, 355 meant lady. Think by the assistance of a lady of my acquaintance shall be able to outwit them all. There's been a lot of controversy over the years. Who is the lady 355? You know, unless we find another Culper letter or another piece of evidence, we'll never know, because that was the only time this lady spy was ever spoken of. Really, Abraham Woodhull should have never spoken about her. You're not supposed to write about your fellow spies in your spy letters. But wouldn't it be interesting if her ability to outwit the British was the ability to be invisible? Enslaved people could come and go and were never questioned. They weren't even seen as real people. They were only viewed of as property. About this time, Robert had joined a loyalist volunteer company. Think of it like a neighborhood watch group. He had made a homemade red coat and would do jobs for the British in the city. Jobs like standing guard outside British headquarters at Bowling Green. If Liz was enslaved in those headquarters, it would have been pretty easy for her to come out and talk to him and tell him things. I'll never be able to prove she's 355, but I'd like for you to put her in the running, maybe right at the top of that list of possible ladies. Now, Robert told his father to just write off her value, that he'd never get her back. But I found twice in his ledger books during the years when he was a spy that he bought her things. He bought her a kind of tea that you used for a cough, horehound tea. And he also bought her a thimble and thread. So Robert actually had contact with Liz. Now, right when the Benedict Arnold plot unraveled, Benedict Arnold actually came to New York City. He switched sides and became a general for the British. Of course, John Andre, Simcoe's friend, was caught in the woods. General George Washington found Andre guilty of being a spy and hanged him to death. But Arnold was spy hunting in Manhattan, and Robert was afraid. He said, "I'm happy to think that Arnold does not know my name, but many, many people that Robert did know that were part of his spy network were arrested when Arnold came to town." So Robert pretty much left town for 3 months. And when he finally came back to New York City, he moved from Hanover Square, where he had had his shop for many years, and relocated way over here to Peck Slip. If you visit Peck Slip today, there's still a historic neighborhood there, and you'll be in the South Street Seaport area. It's not considered out of town now, but in those days, it really was off the beaten track. And he stopped writing culper letters, stopped using that code, stopped using the invisible ink, and would only pass his intelligence in person. So after Benedict Arnold came to New York City and scared Robert so badly, he wouldn't write letters. He would only give his intelligence in person audibly. And then the war ended. You know, after the surrender at Yorktown, there were a few years there, 1782, 1783, when the war was just wrapping up very slowly. And even though we think of Evacuation Day as being November of 1783, a lot of the British left in 1782 as well. And that's what happened with Liss. Her British master was about to leave. He was evacuating to Canada, and Liss was not willing to go with him. But what could she do? What she did was come to Robert and ask him, unbelievably, to buy her back into slavery. Now, Robert, by this time, had begun to believe that slavery was morally wrong. He actually had hired an Irish maid to clean house at his Peck Slip apartment. But Liss was a almost family member to him. Maybe Liss was even something more to him. Liss asked him to repurchase her, and she was also 3 months pregnant. So now Liss entered his Peck Slip apartment, and he wrote his last spy letter. He actually put pen to paper for the very last time, wrote a final letter, and walked it and delivered it up to Benjamin Talmadge in Westchester. And now it's February of 1783, and Liss gave birth in his apartment to a child. It says a child which she had while with her then master, because technically Robert was her master at that time. This person, I believe, is a boy whose name was Harry, and who Robert would later describe as mulatto, the only mixed-race child described as being part of the Townsend group of enslaved people. Now, as I said, Robert had begun to have beliefs that slavery was morally wrong. And Liss, for whatever reason, didn't want to live in Peck Slip anymore. She knew a widow named Anne Sharwin. Anne Sharwin also knew Liss, and together these women wanted to have a household together. Of course, Miss Sharwin would purchase Liss. Liss would be enslaved. And Robert agreed to do this. In later years, he deeply regretted it, but he legally sold Liss and baby Harry, who was about 6 months old, to this recent widow, Anne Sharwin. But he made an agreement with Anne. He said to Anne, look, if you ever want to leave New York City, you've got to contact me so that I can then pay you the value of Liss and take her back into my household, and Harry too. So that was their verbal agreement, but it didn't stick. She didn't remain a widow. She remarried just 1 year later, a very wealthy and very cruel merchant named Alexander Robertson. Immediately after they got married, Alexander Robertson gave Liss some kind of unwanted attention, which caused a derangement and separation and ended the marriage as soon as it had begun. The records of Anne, who had originally owned Liss, just disappear. Somehow Alexander Robertson now legally holds both Liss and baby Harry, who at that point was around 2 years old. And then, out of spite or out of greed, he sold Elizabeth South to Charleston, South Carolina, and he kept 2-year-old baby Harry in New York. They had probably never been separated before. I can only imagine her horrible, gut-wrenching trip down in the hold of a ship to Charleston to be sold to another master down there. She went down there on a ship called the Lucretia. And it was captained by a horrible, villainous man named Captain Tinker, who had actually begun to get a reputation in New York. His side business, besides transporting cargo to Charleston, was to kidnap free Black people in New York and sell them into slavery in Charleston. He was doing this so frequently that people who thought the abolitionist side of the abolition was the correct way to go in New York started paying to put ads like this one in the newspaper to let the free Black population of New York City know Captain Tinker is back in port. You need to be on your guard, lest you should be kidnapped, like so many others had been done. But Liz wasn't kidnapped. When Captain Tinker put her in his brig Lucretia, he was putting her down in the hold, right alongside the Burlington hams and beer in barrels and biscuits in kegs. She was still enslaved, so she was just property like the rest of his cargo. Now, the very same day, the exact day that she arrived in Charleston in the harbor was the same day that up in New York, there was a meeting of a new group, a newly formed group called the Manumission Society. This Manumission Society wanted to end slavery in New York by law, and they were led by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. They also had as one of their founding members, Robert Townsend, and another spy you might have heard of, Hercules Mulligan. This group was wanting to end slavery immediately, but honestly, they couldn't get the votes. So in many ways, this group failed. They did go on to establish the first free Black school for free Black children in New York. Now, the man who brought her down in Charleston had already found his place in American history, but many years earlier. This man, whose name was Captain Richard Palms, had literally been the instigator of the Boston Massacre of 1770. When you see images of the Boston Massacre or read transcripts of the trial of the Boston Massacre, you will see Richard Palms. He is the man with the raised club. And you will hear in the transcripts about how he struck a British soldier, and that's why the bullets started flying. And now, many years later, in 1785, this violent man was the owner of Liss. He had another interesting part to his life that was rather famous. He became the personal bodyguard for John Adams when John Adams, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, crossed the Atlantic to go to Paris, France, and meet and help Benjamin Franklin, who really didn't want John Adams' help in negotiating with the French. And now you're going to think I'm crazy, because here's one of the many red threads of connections in the story that seem almost impossible. At the same time that Richard Palms was bringing John Adams to meet with Benjamin Franklin, Robert Townsend's older brother Solomon, who was a ship's captain, was also meeting with Benjamin Franklin. They were both in court at the same exact time. And why was Solomon there? He had been meeting with Franklin so that he could get a solemn oath of allegiance, so that he could bring his oath of allegiance to America, signed by Benjamin Franklin, back to America and prove that he was a patriot. These incredible crossings of paths of history happened throughout the book, and this is just one example of some of the amazing things I discovered. Now, 2 years went by before Robert found out that Liss was in Charleston. And when he did, he interrogated that man, Alexander Robertson. He physically took baby Harry, who was then 4 years old, brought him back to Oyster Bay, to the Townsend home, and started frantically writing to people who he and his brother knew through business in Charleston, people who he knew also thought slavery was morally wrong, to ask for their help to get Liss back up to New York. Ironically, the group that he joined, the New York Manumission Society, had not succeeded in ending slavery, but they had succeeded in making her return illegal. They had written a law, and it had been passed, that slaves could not cross over New York state lines from another state. So Liss actually had to be smuggled back into New York. But I believe I did find her in a 1789 Oyster Bay Village document from the Baptist Church. Here she is, I hope, Elizabeth, a Black woman, right across from her owner, Samuel Townsend. Of course, we don't know if she's still enslaved here. The letters said that her original owner would give her her freedom if she wished to have it. So this record doesn't say whether she's free or not. Then I think I find her again. Oh, here's the second page of that, showing Samuel's wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Sally, also in that Baptist church records. A lot of people think that the Townsends were Quakers, but they were actually Baptists. And so the following year was the very first census, the first federal census, the 1790 census. And in the town of Oyster Bay, all the way on the South Shore, I think I found her again, living as a free person. Here she is, free Elizabeth, a paid servant in a very large household, the household of David Richard Floyd Jones. You know that expression, keeping up with the Joneses? Those Joneses. They own 6,000 acres of land and what is now Jones Beach and Massapequa. And on that property was a very grand mansion called Fort Neck House. This was an incredible mansion that this man, David Richard Floyd Jones, was only able to inherit, and all the land too, because of an act of the New York State legislature that changed his name from Floyd to Floyd Jones. It's a complicated story of how he inherited all this land, but the bottom line is Samuel Townsend helped him change his name to Floyd Jones as one of his last acts before his death in 1790. And this is where I believe there's at least a good chance Liz ended up. Here's a picture of what the front hall looked like in that grand house. I always imagined that she would have been cleaning these floors and dusting and all the work of the house. This beautiful house was actually photographed in some WPA photos. And so I think about Liz possibly walking up that floating staircase that you see there, or maybe crossing through that archway. But unfortunately, after that 1790 census, all the records of Liz just disappear. We don't know what happened to her after that, because after the 1790 census, her name vanishes. Women, unfortunately, were not listed if they were associated with a man's household. So if Liz took a last name or became part of another man's house, we don't see her name appearing again. What we do know is that in 1827, after 201 years, slavery finally legally ended in New York. It happened on July 4th, 1827. So next year, when you're having your July 4th celebrations with your family, I really hope that you'll remember that it's also Emancipation Day in New York. And so that's where the records of Elizabeth end. She would have been around 30 years old when I lose track of her records. And so she may have lived decades more. If she ever took a last name, I don't know what it is. If Harry ever became free and also took a last name, I don't know. And so here's where you have to come in, people. I want you to look in records and send me any other things that you can find out about Liz. But what I really want you to do is just remember her. Remember her and all of the enslaved people of this period. They were about 16% of the population. And I really want you to keep her and them in your hearts and remember them. And so I hope you'll read my book. It's got so much more detail than I'll ever have time to tell you in just 1 hour. But now I'm going to stop sharing and get to your questions. I hope you've been thinking of good questions for me. So how about it? Any good questions come up in the chat?
Yeah, we do have some, and I encourage
And you can
anybody
bring
else
Tiffany back too. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can obviously write them in the chat now or raise your hand. I just want to take 1 second just to put the link for
signed copies, yeah.
For signed copies.
When you get to that website, make sure you go to the shop page. That's where you can order it. And if you put a note in there about who you want it dedicated to, if it isn't your first name, I'll make sure that happens too. If it's a gift or something.
Right, there we go. So the link's in the chat there. My colleague Bob was having some technical difficulties. So if your question did not reach him, please make sure to raise your hand. So a couple of comments and questions here. This is from Carol. This is an incredible and important program with a great presenter. I had no idea of any of this. I see it as being recorded, and as I mentioned before, and it will be available eventually on our YouTube page She mentions that this program would be great for the Museum of American Revolution, the New York Historical Society, and the Gilda Lehrman Institute of American History.
Yeah, and the Museum of African American History too. I mean, I think
Absolutely.
we have to find space for this story wherever we can, right, Tiff?
Absolutely. And that's one of the wonderful things about it is there are so many different angles to this story, that I think it really touches so many different aspects of American history and so many of them that haven't been represented fully in the past.
And yet it's anchored in stories you already know.
Exactly.
And that's important. If Liz had lived her life, it could have been a very full and interesting life. But if it wasn't anchored to these founding fathers that we already know, it might have been lost or forgotten.
Right. I think it just adds such a fuller picture to some of these narratives that we kind of thought we understood.
Absolutely.
You know, and those people whose stories we might have just looked at as a very simple story, nothing simple when you really dig into it.
So much more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. I had mentioned before we began that one of our other presenters, folks who are with us today may be familiar with Andrew Rimby, who's a Walt Whitman scholar and has given a number of programs. But in the course of those, he's discussed how Walt Whitman's family owned slaves here on Long Island, and that was part of his complicated relationship with American history as well. So I think there are a lot of layers to be uncovered with all of these stories.
And we're finding out more all the time. I don't even know if I mentioned this to you, Tiffany, but I recently found out that Samuel Townsend, the father, I found the names of 3 enslaved people that had been in his household when he was growing up. And that's not to say that they didn't have more than 3, but it gives you some backwards look. Like, yes, Samuel Townsend enslaved these people, but it had been part of his upbringing that's how life was.
And I think that's so significant too, in helping all of us understand that slavery wasn't a Southern problem.
Yeah.
You know, it really is something that we all need to, consider and examine and contend with in American history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the map that you showed at the beginning there with the number of slaves by state certainly is extremely eye-opening. Has there been other historical books and research done in terms of slavery in the North?
Absolutely. I invite everybody to look at the footnotes in our book because there's a lot of them. But in chapter 1, we really give you a great 3 or 4 great sources of scholarly books that can really teach you all about the statistics of slavery in the North.
Great.
Judy has her hand raised.
Yeah, Judy, why don't you go ahead and here, let me, there you go. Judy, you should
We'd
be
love
able
to see your
unmute.
face, Judy, too.
What you just mentioned, several years ago, the Long Island Reads picked a book called The Manor, which, to the surprise of many of us, described the slaveholding manor out on Shelter Island.
Manor of St. George, right?
Yeah, we didn't know that there was a very active slave running trade coming right here into Long Island until that book became, the Long Island Reads book, which meant that every library on Long Island was doing something in conjunction with that book.
And Judy, isn't that the Lloyd family out there?
Yes,
The Lloyd family?
many of the names that we consider, they're the names of parks and highways and roads all over Long Island, are associated with that manor and that slave running trade.
And the other side of that family was Lloyd's Neck, the Lloyds of Lloyd's Neck.
Yeah, I think it was a shock to many of us to know that Long Island was so active in the slave trade when we all thought this was just a Southern thing,
The thing with the Lloyds was they had a fleet of merchant vessels. Samuel Townsend had 5 merchant vessels. And as far as we can see, he wasn't engaged in the slave trade directly, although his brother-in-law, Robert Stoddard, was a ship's captain in Rhode Island and had a heavy slave trade directly to Africa. But his brother-in-law wasn't bringing slaves from Africa back to New York or even to Rhode Island. He was taking them to the Caribbean, to Antigua, because down there they were being enslaved in the sugar trade and in the production of rum. And so we have records of the Townsends buying rum and sugar directly from that man, the brother-in-law, who was enslaving Africans. So we have a very direct slave trade triangle, but it just didn't include the slaves themselves. Although Robert Townsend's brother, Jacob, was selling slaves directly out of his store in Manhattan, just on a smaller scale. But the Lloyds of Lloyd's Neck, they were the folks that enslaved America's first published Black author, Jupiter Hammond. He was enslaved by the Lloyds of Lloyd's Neck. And so the Lloyds out on Manor St. George, they were in direct connection with Lloyds down in the Caribbean. They had a hold of business partner relatives in the Caribbean. And so they were able to bring both goods and slaves directly to that manor out on the end of Long Island.
Incredible story, very important story. Someone in the chat has asked if you could actually display that map again. Do you think you could bring up that slide for us?
It's animated, but I can try. I don't see why I can't. Let's see. Okay, let me go up on the slides. Am I still sharing?
Not right
Not
now.
yet, no.
Okay, so now I'm gonna go down here and share screen. What I'll do is I won't put it in slide mode.
Okay,
Oh, I
yeah,
guess I
just-
have to in order to get to that part of it. You know what? I think I'm so fancy, right? With me and my me and my fancy slideshow, right?
Yeah, you don't have to necessarily put it in slideshow mode if you just
I
want
do
to.
though, because
scroll
it's
down.
behind that one.
Oh, I see. It's gotcha.
So hopefully this will play now. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you.
Yep. And
Another-
so, yeah. So what are the reasons why New York had so much more slavery than, let's say, Pennsylvania? Does anybody want to posit a guess? Jeff, what do you think?
Anyone, you could unmute yourselves if you wish.
Because it was a port city?
Well, Philadelphia was a pretty big shipping area. I mean, it wasn't the port per se. There were other ports. Boston, right? What's another reason?
New York Stock Exchange?
You're in the right direction. New York was founded as New Amsterdam for capitalism, for business. We were founded to make money, and you could make money by enslaving people. That was a great way to increase your money. We weren't founded like Pennsylvania for religious beliefs. And so that capitalism and the agriculture that was concentrated on Long Island and up the Hudson Valley, that agriculture really depended on slave labor. So there's no one answer, but I would say business, capitalism, agriculture were big. And the fact that slavery was, in America, was such that when you had a child, if you were an enslaved woman and you had a child, your child was enslaved at birth by your enslaver. And so permutation begins to happen, math. You have a lot of women, they're having a lot of children, all those children are enslaved. So all those enslaved people weren't coming on boats from Africa. Many of them were completely disassociated from their African heritage because they were just born here and many times sold as a young person away from their family, further disassociating them from their own cultural background.
Many of those children were fathered by the owners of the slaves.
Well, I
And
mean,
yet, and yet they had no hesitancy to enslave their own children.
I would just say that we want to stick with facts and things that we have records of. So I would say that that definitely happened. But in order to say most, we would have to have some kind of evidence or proof of that. Of the enslaved people of the Townsend household, we have this one person who's described of as mulatto, Harry. And the rest are described of as Negro and Black, which doesn't mean that they weren't mixed race. It's just the only things that we have are the evidence at our disposal. So I know that that did happen. I don't know if I'm ready to say most because I just don't know.
The first governor of Pennsylvania, Penn, wasn't he against slavery? And wasn't that part of the reason?
Well, the religious beliefs Yeah, Tiffany, did you have any?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, yes, the Quaker influence in Pennsylvania obviously, would contribute to things as well. And yet we have a number of records of people who were Quakers who still own slaves,
Yeah.
despite the teachings of the church. So again, it's the lines aren't nearly as cut and dry as we would like to think they are, maybe, or as would be convenient for understanding things. So I think, as Claire said, there were a lot of factors that went into how we see some of these numbers. And I mean, you're absolutely correct that the Quaker beliefs, the religious beliefs of people who were predominantly who settled in Pennsylvania did factor in.
And I believe Pennsylvania was the first to end legal slavery.
Right. So yes, that absolutely contributed, but it was not as absolute an abolitionist stronghold as one might think for being predominantly Quaker.
The Quakers, the early founder of Quakerism, George Fox, he started promoting in the 1660s and that era, this idea that you could own a slave as a Quaker, you just had to free them at age 30. And isn't that an interesting wrinkle? It's like, those are the best years of your life, your strength, your youth. Like you can enslave them, but you should really free them at age 30. And that's
when
what
we
happened.
think about age 30, it's not today's age 30. I mean,
Right.
a typical
Especially if you've worked
lifetime
really
is
hard.
in the
Yeah.
mid-30s.
Yeah. And so the first slave freed anywhere on Long Island, who not only was freed in the town of Oyster Bay, not only in the village of Oyster Bay, but whose owner owned the very property that's now Raynham Hall Museum, where Liss was born. That man, whose original African name was Awa, was a man who took the name Tom Gall, freed in 1685. And his enslaver, a Quaker woman named Alice Crabb. In his purchase agreement of 1673, she says, just like George Fox said to, I'll free you at age 30, or when I die, whatever comes first. And lucky for Tom, she died when he was 24, 25 years old. So there's a really interesting example of a Quaker person following this edict of the faith that was sort of 50-50 slavery, not slavery, right? And it resulted in the first slave freed anywhere on Long Island. And I think kids in school should be learning about Tom Gall. They should all know his name by heart. And I'm working hard to get all of this research into the schools. It's important to me to have it embedded into the curriculum of schools.
Yeah, absolutely. So
It's
Claire,
so
in terms of when slavery was eventually outlawed in 1827 in New York, I'm guessing that was not just sort of a flip of a switch and everything changed. I'm curious what kind
a lot of
process happened.
people place that at 1799. You can even find books that say slavery ended in New York in 1799. But there's a catch, right? The catch is this: if you're a woman, you're not eligible to be free until you're 25. And if you're a man, you're not eligible to be free until you're 28. And that's why that 28 threshold gets you to 1827. But even before that, you had to jump through a lot of hoops. If you wanted to free a person, you had to bring them before a board of 2 or 3 townsmen called the overseers of the poor. And you had to prove a lot of things. You had to prove that you owned the slave and how old they were. If it was a woman, even before that, 25, 28, they had to be 21 and they had to be under 50. If you were over 50, you could not be freed. If you were under 21, you could not be freed. And like I say, those numbers went up later on. You also couldn't have a disability. Now, a lot of enslaved people had disabilities because of their enslavement. They had severe malnutrition, torturous behavior, and just the hard work had crippled them in many cases, or they had lost limbs or fingers. Well, that all excluded them from being freed. If you had a visual disability, or it's a million ways you could be disabled. And also, if you were just sick, if you weren't well, you wouldn't qualify for being freed.
You also
had to prove that you had a way of making a living, not just any kind of ability, but an ability that you could make hard physical money at. And that was a huge barrier, huge barrier.
And so I think when, again, looking at history in very simplistic terms, we'd like to think, well, why didn't these people just free all their slaves? If they decided it was bad, why didn't they just set them free? Well, there were so many legal obstacles in place that got increasingly more complicated with time, and in some cases, that made the whole process extremely difficult. So nothing was as simple as just saying, okay, I don't believe in slavery, you're free now. There were so many more obstacles to enabling that to even happen, which again, I think just complicates the whole issue. And I think that shows, as we've said, just how complex these things are. And it's difficult to look back on that with a modern lens and realize just how many legal pieces were in place.
And economic ones too.
Absolutely.
Liz had a sister named Hannah. And in these letters, it talks about her sister who declined taking her freedom. And so in many ways, Hannah's showing agency. She's making up her mind. And she says, right now, at this time in my life, I don't have the resources, or maybe I have small children. When Robert sold Liz to Anne Sharwin, there's an insinuation that it was with Liz's permission of her wanting to do that. She had a 6-month-old. She had no generational wealth. She had no way of making a living. Now, Robert could have taken her into his home, right? And cared for her. And I think he deeply regretted that he didn't do that later on. He became in many ways depressed in his later years.
So Claire, I have a question. In terms of your research, which obviously was a long, painstaking process, I gather, this must have been extra challenging because this was a part of history that was not recorded or written, really. What was that process like for you?
Well, I mean, as you saw in my research, I always like to say I can't necessarily prove that this is her in this record. So I think we have to lower our standards for the records of people who it's our fault that their records are so poorly kept, right? It was our culture that erased them from history and that caused their records, many times enslaved people would not be allowed to have a last name. We see that in the runaway slave ad where Isaac Johnston insists that that is his full name. And his master, who's trying to get him back into enslavement, says, no, he's not. He calls himself that, but his name is Isaac. So looking for little crumbs of information is really painstaking. And I would look both in archives that were connected to the Townsend family and also things like newspaper accounts. As technology changed, as my research went on, those digital records became more and more available. So like institutions like yours, probably 10 or 15 years ago, you didn't have any digital collections online, but do you have anything online now that's a digital sort of access to archives and things like that?
Yeah, we do. We actually have a lot of photographs. There are documents as well. I mean, the process of digitizing all of that is just an ongoing one.
Even at the very end of our research, right, Tiffany, I was still finding things.
We were a week from going to press and Claire found one more thing. And I mean, and that's to me, part of what makes a project like this wonderful is that we think these voices have been silent for so long because they were silenced, and yet there are traces of them. And it's just, so many unfortunately have been completely erased, but when you get a very dogged, determined researcher who can connect those lines, who is willing to follow those rabbit trails like Claire has done, to connect with collections in South Carolina, in Canada, in Michigan, in New York, and bring all of these pieces together that have become so spread out, you can start to piece together certain stories and realize that there is a chance to let some of these silenced people have a voice.
One of the people that's our greatest voice is Vanessa Williams.
Yes.
She's actually written our foreword, and she's part of our story because her ancestors come from this same place, Oyster Bay. And they settled in an area called Pine Hollow, which is where that first slave freed on Long Island, Tom Gall, made his home. He established a free Black neighborhood that's not really recognized. And I was able to make contact with her and really get her to be a champion of lists. So as we go forward and the story gets out more and more, it's hopeful that she'll use her influence to really get it out even to a national audience. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's great. I was actually just about to ask you about her involvement.
Yeah.
There's a recording, I think it may have been for the book launch, that's
It
on,
was
you
the
can find
launch,
on
yeah.
YouTube. And Vanessa Williams is a participant in that. So it's for those wanting to see a little bit more about that part of it. You can certainly check that out online. One thing I also wanted to ask about, this was in terms of, understanding that here on Long Island, you really were, behind enemy lines, as you said. One way I've heard it described in terms of just the general population in the colonies at the time was that roughly 1/3, I'm curious if this is accurate or not, so maybe you can help clarify that 1/3 were in favor of rebellion, about 1/3 were loyal still to the crown, and about 1/3 really stayed neutral, wanted just to continue farming, and we're sort of waiting to see which ways things were going to go and not wanting to, sort of risk being on one
Rocking the
side or
boat.
the other. Yeah, exactly. Is that
Well,
accurate?
in Samuel Townsend's case, we have an actual vote to look at. So the Second Continental Congress of New York was going to now start in 1775, and it was right before a Oyster Bay town meeting. And Samuel had sent word out to all of his fellow neighbors and said, look, we're going to have another Continental Congress. That was the Patriot group that was going to plan an attack. If an attack came, how were we going to address that in New York? He said, okay, at the town meeting, let's vote. Vote to take a representative from Oyster Bay and put them in that Congress. So there was about, 350 townsmen who were voting. 40 of them voted to send a representative. The rest of them said, no, let's not send anybody. We don't want to be part of that. We're going to just sit back and either be neutral or be loyalists. And so Samuel Townsend did not get elected to the New York Provincial Congress in his own town. They finally agreed, the 40 of them got back together and said, let's just send someone and see what happens. So they sent this guy, Zebulon Williams. He showed up at the first day of the Second New York Congress. And the congressman scorned him. They said, hey, you didn't even get the votes of Oyster Bay. You can sit in the back, but you can't vote. Then 2 days later was Lexington and Concord. And boy, did our New York Congress change their mind then. They were like, you know what? We welcome any and all that'll come and join us. And so Samuel and his brother, James Townsend, went to Jamaica, and they became members of that Congress around their own village.